September of 34, I was standing on the courthouse steps in Millbrook, watching them sell off the Henderson place piece by piece. Drought had taken most folks' land that year, but what happened next wasn't about money, it was about meanness. Sheriff Dugan dragged a woman onto the platform, still wearing her work dress, flour dust on her hands from the morning's baking. "Got ourselves a situation," he announced to the crowd of maybe 30 men. "Lila Henderson here can't pay her husband's debts. Bank's taking the farm, but there's still $300 owing. Anyone want to take responsibility for her upkeep in exchange for labor?" The men laughed, not the good kind of laughter, the kind that makes you ashamed to be human. I'd buried my wife 2 winters back, knew I should have kept walking, minded my own business like every other decent man in town. But my daddy taught me something about dignity that wouldn't let me move my feet. By sundown, one of us would be dead, or I'd be the biggest fool in 3 counties. Either way, there was no walking away from what I was about to do. Millbrook's Courthouse Square hadn't seen this many men since the 4th of July, and that was before the drought turned our celebrations into penny-pinching affairs. But foreclosure sales drew a crowd, partly for the bargains, mostly for the spectacle of watching your neighbors fall. I'd come for fence wire. The Henderson farm had 3 good rolls of it, and my north pasture was held together with prayer and rust. Didn't plan on bidding for anything else. Lila Henderson stood on that platform like she was made of iron, even with her hands trembling. She was maybe 35, though hard years can age a woman faster than time. Her husband Earl had drunk himself to death the previous spring, leaving her with 200 acres of dust and debts that kept multiplying like rabbits. "Now, gentlemen," Sheriff Dugan continued, hooking his thumbs in his belt, "Mrs. Henderson here is healthy, can cook, clean, and manage a household. She's got no family willing to take her. The law says someone's got to be responsible for her debts and her person. Think of it as Christian charity with practical benefits." The crowd snickered. I recognized most of them. Farmers like me, a few shopkeepers, the bank manager Horace Pettigrew standing in the shade looking pleased with himself. Earl Henderson had borrowed from Pettigrew's bank, and now Pettigrew was getting the land and probably hoping to profit off the widow too. "$20, called out Samuel Pritchard, who ran the feed store. "She can work off her keep in the back room." More laughter. Lila's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes fixed on the horizon like she was somewhere else entirely. "30, said Vernon Goss, a pig farmer with hands like hams and a wife already worked half to death. "Could use help with the slaughtering." I felt something rising in my chest, same feeling I got the day I found a man beating his dog behind the grain elevator. Anger, yes, but something colder too, more dangerous. 40, Pettigrew called out, not even bothering to hide his smile. "Mrs. Henderson can settle her late husband's account by keeping house for me. I'm a widower myself, after all. Seems appropriate." The way he said appropriate made my skin crawl. Everyone knew what he meant. Lila's face went white, but she didn't flinch, just kept staring at those distant hills like she could will herself to disappear into them. My daddy, God rest him, used to say there are moments in a man's life when he finds out what he's made of. Not the big moments you plan for, the small ones that sneak up and demand an answer before you've had time to think it through properly. $200, I heard myself say. The square went dead quiet. Even the flies seemed to stop buzzing. Sheriff Dugan blinked at me like I'd sprouted a second head. "Elwood? Elwood Garrett, that you?" "It is." "You said $200? I did. Pettigrew stepped forward, his face flushed. "That's more than the outstanding debt, Garrett. What kind of fool?" "The kind that pays his bills," I interrupted, keeping my voice level. "Mrs. Henderson's debt is $300, you said. I'm offering $200 cash money for the right to settle her accounts and provide for her household. That leaves $100 owing, which I'll work out terms for with the bank. Directly." I looked at Pettigrew when I said that last part, made sure he knew I wasn't buying a woman, I was buying her freedom from him. The crowd started murmuring. Lila Henderson's eyes finally left those distant hills and found my face. She didn't look grateful. She looked terrified, which I understood. Better the devil you know than the stranger who just spent $200, most of his savings, though nobody knew that, for reasons she couldn't fathom. That's... Sheriff Dugan consulted his papers, clearly out of his depth. That's irregular, Elwood. The law requires someone to take responsibility for her person as well as her debts. You got a wife who'll agree to this arrangement? I'm a widower, I said. Have been for 2 years. Got a spare room and no interest in anything but keeping my word. Mrs. Henderson can work off her room and board with honest labor. Cooking, cleaning, whatever suits. She'll have her dignity, and I'll have help around the place. Everybody wins except the vultures. I didn't look at Pettigrew when I said that last part, but I didn't need to. The anger rolling off him was hot enough to feel from 20 paces. Anyone else want a bid? Dugan asked, sounding like he hoped someone would end this madness. Silence. Nobody was fool enough to outbid $200 for spite alone, except maybe Pettigrew, and he was too smart to show his hand that way. Sold then, to Elwood Garrett. The gavel came down like a gunshot. As I walked toward the platform to sign the papers, I caught sight of Pettigrew's face. The look he gave me wasn't just anger, it was a promise. I'd just made myself an enemy of the most powerful man in 3 counties, and we both knew it. My farm sat 3 miles north of Millbrook, far enough that you couldn't hear the church bells on Sunday, close enough that I could make the trip to town for supplies without losing half a day. The house wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room my wife Martha had kept neat as a pin. Since she'd passed, I'd let things slide. Dishes stacked in the basin, dust on the windowsills. That particular loneliness that settles into a place when there's no woman's touch to chase it out. Lila Henderson didn't say a word the entire ride, just sat in the wagon bed with her one carpet bag, staring at her hands like they held answers I couldn't see. I didn't push conversation. Woman had been through enough for one day. When we pulled up to the house, she finally spoke. Where do you want me to sleep? Guest room's on the east side, I said, climbing down. Gets good morning light. I'm on the west. Door's got a lock if that makes you feel easier. She looked at me sharp then, trying to figure my angle. Most men don't offer locks to women they've just bought. Didn't buy you, Mrs. Henderson. Bought your debt. There's a difference. Is there? Her voice was flat, exhausted. Because from where I'm standing, I'm still property that changed hands for cash money. I carried her bag to the porch, then turned to face her square. You want to leave, there's the road. I won't stop you. But if you stay, you work for wages same as any hired hand. 50 cents a day plus room and board. When you've worked off what I paid, you're free to go wherever suits you. I'll give you a letter of reference and enough money for train fare. 50 cents a day. She did the arithmetic in her head. At that rate, I'd be here over a year. About that, yes, ma'am. And what happens if I'm not satisfactory? The way she said it made clear she'd heard that word before, in context that had nothing to do with cooking or cleaning. Then we'll work it out like adults. I've got no interest in anything but honest labor, Mrs. Henderson. You've got my word on that, for whatever a stranger's word is worth. She studied me for a long moment, then picked up her bag. Show me the room. The first week passed quietly. Too quietly, if I'm being honest. Lila kept to herself, did her work with an efficiency that suggested she'd run a household before Earl Henderson's drinking had run it into the ground. She could make a decent meal from almost nothing, important skill in those days, and she didn't waste words when silence would do, but the town noticed. Of course they did. When I went to Pritchard's feed store on Thursday, the conversation died the moment I walked in. Samuel Pritchard weighed out my order without meeting my eyes, and when I paid, he counted the coins twice like he was checking for forgery. How's your arrangement working out? He finally asked. Fine. Mrs. Henderson's a good worker. I bet she is. The way he said it made my jaw tighten. At the post office, Mrs. Fletcher, who'd been the town gossip since before I was born, made a show of tisking when she saw me. Elwood Garrett, I'm surprised at you. A widow woman living under your roof with no proper chaperone. Your poor Martha would be spinning in her grave. My poor Martha, I said evenly, would have invited Mrs. Henderson to stay the moment she heard what Pettigrew had planned for her. Martha had strong opinions about men who prey on desperate women. Mrs. Fletcher's face went red, but she held her tongue, barely. The real trouble started Friday evening. I was mending fence on the south pasture when I saw 3 riders coming up the road. I recognized them before they got close. Pettigrew's men. Not the banker himself, he was too smart to dirty his own hands, but his foreman, Carl Drucker, and 2 ranch hands whose names I never bothered learning. Drucker was a thick-necked man with a jaw like a shovel blade. He'd worked for Pettigrew for 10 years, doing whatever needed doing that couldn't be mentioned in polite company. "Garrett," he called out, not bothering to dismount. "Mr. Pettigrew sent us to check on Mrs. Henderson. Make sure she's being treated proper." I set down my tools and walked toward them slow. Gave myself time to think, time to let the anger settle somewhere I could control it. "Mrs. Henderson's fine. You can tell Pettigrew she's working off her debt according to the terms we agreed on." "See, that's the thing." Drucker leaned forward in his saddle, his smile showing too many teeth. "Mr. Pettigrew's concerned about the morality of the situation. A single woman living with a single man, no proper supervision. Folks are talking. Sheriff might need to investigate whether Mrs. Henderson's being kept in appropriate conditions." The threat was clear enough. Pettigrew couldn't get Lila through the auction, so he'd use the law to manufacture a scandal. Get the sheriff involved, maybe have a judge declare the arrangement improper, put Lila back on the block where Pettigrew could scoop her up for pennies. "You tell Pettigrew," I said quietly, "that everything happening on my property is legal and proper. Mrs. Henderson's got her own room, her own wages, and her own dignity. If the sheriff wants to investigate, he's welcome any time." "That an invitation?" Drucker asked. "It's a fact." The 3 men sat there for a moment, letting the silence stretch. Then Drucker tipped his hat, that same wolfish grin still fixed on his face. "We'll be seeing you again, Garrett, real soon." They turned their horses and rode off, dust trailing behind them like a threat. I stood there watching until they disappeared over the hill, my hands clenched so tight my knuckles had gone white. When I finally headed back to the house, I found Lila standing in the doorway. She'd seen the whole thing. "I should leave," she said, "before this gets worse." "No, ma'am," I replied. "That's exactly what they want." Sunday morning came whether you wanted it or not. In Millbrook, missing church meant something, marked you as either godless or guilty, and folks didn't much distinguish between the two. I hadn't planned on attending, figured Lila and I would lay low, let the gossip burn itself out like a grass fire. But Saturday night she'd appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing the one decent dress she'd salvaged from the auction. "We're going to church tomorrow," she'd said, not asking, telling. "That might not be wise, Mrs. Henderson." "Probably not, but hiding makes us look guilty. I've got nothing to be ashamed of, Mr. Garrett. Do you?" So there we were, walking up the steps of Millbrook Baptist at 9:45, every eye in the churchyard fixed on us like we were a 2-headed calf at the county fair. Reverend Walsh stood at the door, greeting parishioners. He was a good man, mostly, the kind who'd comfort you through grief but wouldn't stand up to his deacons when money and power were involved. His handshake was firm enough when I reached him, but his eyes slid away too quick. "Elwood, Mrs. Henderson, good to see you both." "Reverend," I nodded, moving toward the door. Horace Pettigrew materialized from the shadows of the vestibule like a spider that had been waiting in its web. He wore his Sunday suit and his church face, all pious concern and brotherly love. "Brother Elwood," he said, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, "and Sister Lila, might I have a word before service?" "We're running a bit late," I started, but Lila touched my arm. "Let him speak," she said quietly. "Better to face it head on." Pettigrew's smile widened. He'd been hoping for an audience. "The deacons have been discussing your arrangement. As pillars of this community, we have certain concerns about the moral example being set." "What concerns?" I kept my voice level. "A man and woman, both unmarried, living under the same roof with no proper chaperone." He said it like he was reading from scripture. "It creates an appearance of impropriety." "Now, I'm sure nothing untoward is happening." His pause made clear he was sure of no such thing. "But we must consider how things look to the younger members of our congregation." People were gathering now, forming a semicircle around us on the church steps. Samuel Pritchard, Vernon Goss, the bank manager, the feed store owner, Mrs. Fletcher and her clutch of gossips. Carl Drucker, lurking at the edge with that same wolf's grin. "What exactly are you proposing, Horace?" I asked. "The Deacons feel Mrs. Henderson should be placed with a proper Christian family. The Pritchards have generously offered to take her in. She'd have female supervision, separate quarters, everything above reproach." I looked at Samuel Pritchard's face, that hungry, satisfied look, and understood immediately. Pettigrew couldn't get Lila through the auction, couldn't get her through the law, so he'd use the church. Put her somewhere he could control, somewhere his allies would make sure she understood her place. "That's generous of the Pritchards," I said carefully. "What does Mrs. Henderson think of this arrangement?" All eyes turned to Lila. She stood straight, chin up, and I saw what the others didn't. The slight tremor in her hands, the tightness around her eyes. She was terrified, but she'd be damned if she'd show it. "I think," she said, her voice carrying across the churchyard, "that I'm a grown woman who's been making my own decisions since I was 15 years old. I appreciate the deacon's concern for my immortal soul, but my living arrangement with Mr. Garrett is legal, proper, and nobody's business but our own." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Women didn't speak like that in public, especially not to deacons, especially not when they were dependent on community charity. Pettigrew's face hardened. "Sister Lila, I understand you've been through hardship. But pride is a sin, and your current situation—" "My current situation," Lila interrupted, and now there was steel in her voice, "is that I'm working honest labor for honest wages, paying off debts that weren't mine to begin with, and sleeping in my own room with a locked door. If that offends your sensibilities, Mr. Pettigrew, perhaps you should examine why a woman having her own space and her own dignity bothers you so much." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either violence or revelation. I saw it in their faces, some shocked, some angry, but a few, just a few, showing something that might have been respect. Pettigrew recovered quickly. "The deacons will be meeting this afternoon to discuss this matter formally. Given Mrs. Henderson's attitude, we may need to involve Sheriff Dugan. There are vagrancy laws, after all. Moral turpitude statutes. Ways to ensure proper Christian order is maintained." He let that threat hang in the air, then turned and walked into the church, his allies following like ducklings behind a hen. The crowd began to disperse, whispers rising like smoke. Lila stood motionless, and I saw her hands were shaking worse now. "That was brave," I said quietly. "Maybe not smart, but brave." "I'm tired of being scared," she replied. "Tired of men like him deciding what's proper for me. They'll come for us now, you understand that?" She nodded. "Let them come." As we turned to leave, there was no point attending service now. I caught sight of a face in the crowd that surprised me. Doc Miller, the town physician, watching with an expression I couldn't quite read. He gave me the smallest nod, then disappeared into the church. It wasn't much, but it was something. By sunset, the deacons would decide our fate. And Horace Pettigrew had just made clear he'd use every tool at his disposal, legal, social, religious, to make sure that fate ended with Lila Henderson back under his control. The first battle was lost, but the war wasn't over yet. Monday morning, I tried to make things feel normal, fed the chickens, mended the barn door that had been hanging crooked since winter, checked the irrigation ditches even though there wasn't enough water to irrigate a postage stamp. Lila worked in the garden, coaxing life from soil that seemed determined to stay dust. Around noon, Doc Miller rode up the lane on his old bay mare. He was maybe 60, with kind eyes and hands that had delivered half the babies in the county, including me. When a man like Doc Miller pays a social call on a Monday, it means something. "Elwood," he greeted, dismounting stiffly. "Mrs. Henderson." "Doc." I set down my tools. "What brings you out?" He glanced at Lila, then back to me. "Might we speak privately?" Lila wiped her hands on her apron. "I'll put coffee on." She headed toward the house, understanding that whatever he had to say wasn't for mixed company. Doc waited until she was inside. "The deacons met yesterday afternoon. Voted 4-1 to petition Sheriff Dugan to investigate your household for moral turpitude." My stomach dropped. "On what grounds?" "Doesn't matter. You know how these things work. Pettigrew's got the sheriff in his pocket same as everyone else who owes money to his bank. They'll find something, Improper sleeping arrangements, lack of chaperone, whatever excuse serves. Then they'll haul Mrs. Henderson before a judge, declare the situation unfit, and place her with the Pritchards or whoever Pettigrew designates. That's not law. That's kidnapping dressed up in legal papers. Welcome to how the world works when you've got no money and powerful enemies. Doc pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, mopped his forehead. I voted against it, for what that's worth. But I'm one voice, and Pettigrew owns the other four. Why are you telling me this? Doc looked at me hard. Because I knew your daddy, and I knew Martha. They were good people, and they raised you right. What you did at that auction, standing up when everyone else was happy to watch a woman get sold to the highest bidder, that took guts. Reminded me there's still some decency left in this county. He paused. But decency don't win fights against money and power, son. You need to be smart about this. What would you suggest? Get her out of here, tonight. I've got a cousin in Tulsa, runs a boarding house for working women. Respectable place. I can write you a letter of introduction. Get Mrs. Henderson on a bus, let this blow over, then maybe in 6 months when Pettigrew's found some other poor soul to torment. No, Lila's voice came from the porch. She'd been listening. I'm not running anymore. Doc turned to her, sympathy creasing his weathered face. Mrs. Henderson, I understand your pride, but you need to think practical. These men will destroy you if you give them the chance. They've already destroyed me, she said quietly. Took my farm. My husband drank himself into the grave trying to cope with debts we couldn't pay. And they auctioned me off like livestock. The only thing I've got left is my dignity, and I'll be damned if I let Horace Pettigrew take that too. Dignity don't fill your belly when you're in jail, Doc said, not unkindly. Maybe not. But I've spent my whole life bending to what other people said was proper and right and lawful. Married Earl because my daddy said I should. Stayed when he drank because the church said divorce was a sin. Smiled and nodded while my life fell apart because good women don't make scenes. She stepped off the porch, her eyes fierce. I'm done bending, Doc. If they want to arrest me for the crime of having a roof over my head and honest work in my hands, let them try. Before Doc could respond, we heard it, the sound of horses, multiple riders coming up the road from town. Doc's face went pale. That's faster than I expected. I counted 6 riders as they crested the hill. Sheriff Dugan in front, Carl Drucker and 4 other men behind him. Pettigrew wasn't with them. He never dirtied his own hands, but his presence hung over the group like a shadow. Stay behind me, I told Lila. No, she said. Mrs. Henderson, I said no. This is my fight too. The riders pulled up in my yard, their horses stamping and snorting. Dugan looked uncomfortable, which told me everything I needed to know about how he felt about this errand. Elwood, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. Mrs. Henderson, I've got a court order here requiring me to investigate the moral fitness of this household. I'm going to need to search the premises and ask you both some questions. What judge signed that order? Doc Miller demanded, stepping forward. Because Judge Harrison's in Oklahoma City this week, and Judge Clemens wouldn't sign something like this without a formal hearing. Dugan's jaw tightened. Judge Pettigrew. Of course, Horace Pettigrew's brother, Circuit Judge Walter Pettigrew, who rode through every 6 weeks and ruled on whatever cases his brother wanted ruled on. That's not legal, Doc said. Walter Pettigrew has a conflict of interest. I've got a signed order, Dugan interrupted. That makes it legal enough. He looked at me. Are you going to let me conduct my investigation, or are we going to have trouble? I saw Carl Drucker's hand resting on his gun belt, saw the other men fanning out slightly, surrounding us. 6 armed men against 1 farmer, 1 widow, and an elderly doctor. The mathematics of violence were simple and ugly. Search the house, I said quietly. But Mrs. Henderson's not answering any questions without legal representation present. Legal representation? Drucker laughed. Who's going to represent her? Only lawyer in 3 counties is Samuel Pritchard's nephew, and he ain't taking her case. The trap was complete. They'd thought of everything. Sheriff Dugan dismounted, his face grim, as he walked toward my house, my home, to find whatever manufactured evidence they'd decided would serve. I caught Lila's eye. She was scared. I was scared, but neither of us looked away. Whatever happens, I said quietly, You've got nothing to be ashamed of. Neither do you, Mr. Garrett. The sun was lowering toward the western hills, painting everything in shades of amber and blood. By nightfall, one of us would be in jail, or both of us would be, or something worse would happen that I couldn't yet imagine. Doc Miller stepped close, his voice barely a whisper. There's still time to run. I watched Sheriff Dugan disappear into my house, Carl Drucker following with that satisfied wolf grin. No, I said. There isn't. They found nothing. Sheriff Dugan spent an hour going through my house, 2 bedrooms on opposite sides, separate as Sunday from Monday. Lila's door had a working lock, key on her side. My room was sparse as a monk's cell, no evidence of impropriety because there wasn't any to find. But that didn't stop them from trying to manufacture some awful convenient, Carl Drucker said, standing in Lila's doorway. How everything's so proper and arranged, almost like you knew we were coming. Almost like some people live decent lives without needing to hide anything, Doc Miller shot back. Dugan interviewed us separately, him with his notebook, Drucker leaning against the wall with that perpetual smirk, asked invasive questions about sleeping arrangements, daily routines, whether we took meals together. Every answer I gave was truth, plain and simple, but I could see how they'd twist it later. Takes meals together becomes intimate dinners. Works in the house becomes performs wifely duties. When they finally left, Dugan looked almost apologetic. I'll file my report with Judge Pettigrew, probably hear back in a few days. We both knew what that report would say, regardless of what he'd actually found. That evening, Lila and I sat on the porch as the sun went down. Neither of us had much appetite for supper. The weight of what was coming pressed down like weather before a storm. I'm sorry, she said finally. You spent $200 and got nothing but trouble for your money. Got a clean house and decent cooking, I replied, and the satisfaction of knowing Horace Pettigrew's been losing sleep over not getting his way. She almost smiled at that. Almost. Why did you really do it? She asked. At the auction. You could have walked away. Should have walked away. I was quiet for a moment, watching the last light fade from the western hills. My wife Martha, toward the end, the cancer had her pretty bad. She made me promise something. Said when she was gone, I shouldn't let the world make me hard. Said hardness was easy, but kindness took courage. I looked at Lila. Standing on those courthouse steps, watching them auction you off like livestock, I heard Martha's voice clear as day. Elwood Garrett, you walk away from this, you'll never forgive yourself. Lila's eyes were shining with tears she wouldn't let fall. Your Martha was a wise woman. She was that. We sat in silence a while longer. Then Lila did something unexpected. Reached over and took my hand. Not romantic, not forward. Just one human being reaching for another in the darkness. Thank you, she said quietly, for seeing me as a person worth saving. I squeezed her hand back. You saved yourself, Mrs. Henderson. I just paid the bill. Tuesday morning brought an unexpected visitor. Judge Harrison, the real circuit judge, not Walter Pettigrew's kangaroo court version, rode up on a dapple gray gelding. He was 70 if he was a day, with a shock of white hair and eyes that had seen every kind of human foolishness. Heard you've been having trouble, Elwood, he said, accepting the coffee Lila brought out. Some, Your Honor. Walter Pettigrew issued an order in my circuit while I was away. That's irregular. He sipped his coffee, especially since the order concerns a legal financial arrangement properly executed before witnesses. Tell me, Mrs. Henderson, are you being held against your will? No, sir. Are you being mistreated, abused, or forced into any improper behavior? No, sir. Mr. Garrett's been nothing but respectful. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. Then as far as I can see, there's no legal basis for intervention. You're both adults, the arrangement is voluntary, and the debt settlement was witnessed and recorded. He pulled out a paper from his coat. I'm issuing a counter-order nullifying Walter's investigation. If Sheriff Dugan comes back, you show him this. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Why would you do this, Your Honor? His expression hardened. Because Horace Pettigrew's been running roughshod over this county for 10 years, using his brother's judgeship and his bank's leverage to get whatever he wants. It's past time someone reminded him that law still means something. He stood. Though I'll warn you, this won't end it. Pettigrew doesn't take losing well. He'll find another angle. Let him try, Lila said, and there was steel in her voice. After Judge Harrison left, we both felt something that had been absent for days. Hope. Small, fragile, but real. That hope lasted exactly 4 hours. Doc Miller rode up again at sunset, his face grim. You need to hear this. Pettigrew's called a town meeting for tomorrow night. Says he's got new evidence about Mrs. Henderson's character, evidence that will require immediate community action. What kind of evidence? I demanded. Don't know, but whatever it is, he's got people worked up. There's talk, Elwood, bad talk. He paused. Talk about tar and feathers. Talk about running her out of town on a rail. Lila went pale. He's going to accuse me of something. Worse than that, Doc said quietly. He's going to prove it, or make people think he's proved it, which amounts to the same thing. He looked at me. I'm hearing words like adultery, seduction, corrupting a Christian household. Whatever he's planning, it's designed to destroy both of you beyond any legal remedy. My hands clenched into fists. We've got Judge Harrison's order. Won't matter if there's a mob, son. Law's only good as long as people respect it. Get 100 men with torches and righteous anger. Legal orders might as well be kindling. The sun was setting again, painting the sky blood red. 24 hours until the town meeting. 24 hours to figure out what Pettigrew had planned and how to stop it. Lila stood, her face set with determination. Then we'd better get ready, because whatever lies he's planning to tell, I'm going to stand in front of that whole town and speak the truth. Truth don't always win, Doc warned. Maybe not, she said, but it's all I've got left. As Doc rode away into the gathering darkness, I realized we were standing at the edge of something that couldn't be undone. Tomorrow night, in front of the whole town, Horace Pettigrew would make his play, and whatever happened after that would determine whether justice or power ruled this county. I looked at Lila, standing straight and proud despite her fear. We'll face it together, I said. She nodded. Together. But neither of us knew if together would be enough. Wednesday morning, I rode into town alone, told Lila to stay at the farm where it was safer, though we both knew nowhere was truly safe anymore. I needed to understand what Pettigrew was planning, and the only way to do that was to walk into the lion's den with my eyes open. The town felt different. Men I'd known my whole life crossed the street to avoid me. Women clutched their children closer when I passed. The bank, the feed store, the post office, everywhere I went, conversations stopped and eyes followed. I was buying rope at the hardware store when Samuel Pritchard approached. His face was flushed, excited in a way that turned my stomach. Heard about the meeting tonight, he said, not bothering to lower his voice. Pettigrew's got testimony, real testimony, about you and Mrs. Henderson. Testimony from who? He smiled. You'll find out soon enough. But I'll say this. When a woman's own kin comes forward to speak against her character, well, that carries weight. My blood went cold. Lila doesn't have any family in Oklahoma. Funny thing about family, Pritchard said. Sometimes they show up when you least expect them. I rode back to the farm, my mind racing. Lila was hanging laundry when I arrived, and the moment she saw my face, she knew something was wrong. What is it? Pettigrew's found someone claiming to be your family, someone willing to testify against you. The clothespin fell from her hand. That's impossible. My parents are dead. My only brother died in the war. There's no one. She stopped, her face going pale. Earl's brother, Raymond. I didn't know Earl had a brother. He does. Did. We haven't spoken in 3 years, not since... She wrapped her arms around herself. Not since Raymond tried to convince Earl to commit me to an asylum. Said I was hysterical, unfit. Really, he just wanted Earl to sign over the farm to him. When Earl refused, Raymond left, swore he'd make us both pay. And now Pettigrew's found him. She nodded, her eyes distant. Raymond will say anything for money, and as Earl's brother, his testimony will carry weight. They'll say I drove Earl to drink, that I'm unstable, that I seduced you into this arrangement." Her voice broke. "They'll win, Elwood. We can't fight family testimony." I wanted to argue, to tell her we'd find a way, but the mathematics were stark. A brother-in-law's testimony, combined with town gossip and Pettigrew's influence, it would be enough to destroy us both. That afternoon, as we sat in the kitchen trying to figure out what to do, we heard a wagon coming up the road. I reached for my rifle, expecting more trouble. Instead, it was Vernon Goss, the pig farmer who'd bid on Lila at the auction. "Stay inside," I told Lila, then stepped onto the porch. "Vernon, what brings you out?" He climbed down from his wagon, moving slow like a man carrying a heavy burden. Up close, I could see the bruises on his face, half hidden, but fresh. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. "Private-like?" I hesitated, then nodded. We walked toward the barn, out of earshot from the house. Vernon cleared his throat. "I came to say I'm sorry. For bidding on Mrs. Henderson that day. For laughing with the others. For—" He gestured vaguely. "All of it. Bit late for apologies." "I know, but you need to hear what's happening." He looked back toward town. "My wife Sarah, she heard about the meeting tonight. Heard what Pettigrew's planning. She told me if I didn't come warn you, she'd leave me. Said she didn't marry a coward who stands by while good people get destroyed." "Your face," I said, noticing the bruises again. "Pettigrew's men?" He nodded. "Carl Drucker and 2 others. Caught me outside the feed store yesterday after Sarah spoke her mind to Mrs. Fletcher about the whole situation. Told me if I didn't keep my woman quiet, next time it'd be worse." He met my eyes. "I got a wife and 3 daughters, Elwood. I can't afford to cross Pettigrew openly, but Sarah's right. What's happening ain't Christian, ain't decent, and ain't right." "So you came to warn us. That's something, I suppose." "More than warn." Vernon pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "Raymond Henderson's testimony, it's false. I know because Raymond came through town last month, before any of this started with Mrs. Henderson. He was drunk at my place, bragging about how his brother's widow would get what was coming to her, how he'd already written letters to county officials claiming she was unfit." "You're saying he planned this before Pettigrew even got involved?" "I'm saying Raymond Henderson's been trying to destroy his brother's widow for years. Pettigrew just gave him the opportunity to do it with community backing." He handed me the paper. I wrote down everything Raymond said that night. Dates, details, witnesses who were there. It won't be enough to stop the meeting, but it might be enough to cast doubt on his testimony. I stared at the paper, hardly believing what I was holding. "Why would you do this? You said yourself you can't afford to cross Pettigrew." Vernon's jaw tightened. "Because Sarah's right. If good men stay silent while evil happens, we're not good men at all. We're just cowards." He looked at the bruises on his knuckles. "Already paid part of the price. Might as well make it mean something. Pettigrew will come after you harder when this comes out." "Probably, but I'll sleep better knowing I tried." He climbed back into his wagon. "Meeting's at 7. You'll need more than my testimony to win, but it's a start. Doc Miller's talking to some others who are having second thoughts. We'll see who shows up when it matters." As he drove away, I stood holding that piece of paper like it was made of gold. It wasn't much. One man's testimony against a coordinated attack. But it was more than we'd had an hour ago. When I walked back to the house, Lila was standing in the doorway. "Vernon Goss?" she asked, disbelief in her voice. "Turns out even men who bid on women at auctions can grow a conscience. Will his testimony be enough?" I looked at the paper, then at the sun lowering toward the western hills. 4 hours until the meeting. 4 hours to figure out if we had any other allies willing to stand up when it counted. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it's better than facing them alone." She nodded slowly, then straightened her shoulders. "Then we better get ready. Whatever happens tonight, I'm not going to that meeting looking defeated." As we prepared for the fight ahead, I thought about Vernon Goss driving away with bruises on his face, risking everything because his wife reminded him what kind of man he wanted to be. Sometimes courage doesn't look like charging into battle. Sometimes it looks like a pig farmer with a piece of paper doing the right thing when it costs him everything. The question was, would it be enough? By 7 o'clock, we'd have our answer. The town hall was packed by the time we arrived. Every bench filled, men standing along the walls, women crowded in the back. The air was thick with sweat and righteousness, a dangerous combination. Horace Pettigrew stood at the front like a preacher preparing for revival, flanked by his brother Judge Walter and Carl Drucker. Raymond Henderson sat to the side, a weaselly man with Earl's weak chin and none of his better qualities. When Lila and I walked in, the room went silent. And then the whispers started, hissing like snakes in tall grass. "There's order to proceedings," Sheriff Dugan announced, looking uncomfortable in his role. "Mr. Pettigrew has called this meeting to address concerns about moral fitness in our community. Everyone will get their say, but we'll do it civilized." Pettigrew stepped forward, his voice carrying to every corner. "Good Christians of Millbrook, we gather tonight to address a cancer growing in our midst. When we allow immorality to flourish unchecked, we endanger not just individual souls, but the fabric of our entire community." He had them. I could see it in their faces, the hunger for spectacle, the relief of having someone to blame for the hard times we all faced. "We've heard troubling reports about the arrangement between Elwood Garrett and Mrs. Lila Henderson, a widow woman living under a bachelor's roof with no proper supervision. Suspicious, certainly. But tonight, we have something more concrete." He gestured to Raymond, a family member willing to speak truth, however painful. Raymond stood, affecting a sorrowful expression that fooled no one who actually knew him. "It pains me to speak against my late brother's widow, but conscience demands it. Lila was always unstable, prone to hysteria. Earl tried to help her, God rest his soul, but she drove him to drink with her ways, wild thoughts, inappropriate behavior. Toward the end, she was entertaining men at the farm, while Earl was too drunk to notice." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Lila's face went white, but she stood firm. "That's a lie," she said clearly. "Is it?" Pettigrew interjected smoothly. "Or is it the uncomfortable truth that you seduced Mr. Garrett into this arrangement with promises of favors? That you're using him the same way you used other men, trading on your feminine wiles to avoid honest work?" "I work 14 hours a day," Lila said, her voice rising. "I cook, clean, tend the garden, mend clothes. I earn every cent of my wages through honest labor, and I've never—" "She's lying," Raymond shouted. "I have letters, evidence of her conduct. She's a Jezebel who destroyed my brother, and now she's corrupting—" "Enough." The voice came from the back of the room. Everyone turned. Doc Miller pushed through the crowd, followed by Vernon Goss. And behind them, my heart jumped. At least a dozen others. Men and women I'd known my whole life, looking scared but determined. "This is irregular," Judge Walter Pettigrew protested. "So is a kangaroo court dressed up as a town meeting," Doc shot back. He looked at me. "Elwood, you got that paper Vernon gave you?" I pulled out Vernon's testimony and handed it to Doc, who read it aloud. Every word Raymond had spoken a month ago, bragging about destroying Lila, planning his revenge before Pettigrew ever got involved. "Raymond Henderson's been trying to steal his brother's farm for years," Doc concluded. "This isn't about morality, it's about greed dressed up in righteous language." "Lies," Raymond sputtered. "They're protecting her because she's innocent," a woman's voice interrupted. Mrs. Sarah Goss stood up, her face flushed but firm. "I've known Lila Henderson for 10 years. She's worked harder than any 3 women I know. While her husband drank, she kept that farm running until there was nothing left to run. And when this town threw her away like garbage, Elwood Garrett was the only man decent enough to remember she's a human being with dignity." More voices joined in. The baker's wife, whose daughter Lila had nursed through scarlet fever. Old Tom Mitchell, who Earl Henderson had once helped during a bad winter. One by one, people stood, not many, maybe 20 out of 100, but enough to crack Pettigrew's certainty. Judge Walter banged his gavel. "This is descending into chaos. The question before us is simple. Is Mrs. Henderson's living arrangement appropriate under community standards? Then let me make it appropriate." The words came from my mouth before I'd fully thought them through. "Mrs. Henderson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The room exploded. Lila stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. "This is absurd," Pettigrew shouted over the chaos. "A desperate ploy. It's legal. Judge Harrison's voice cut through the noise. He'd been sitting quietly in the corner, and now he stood. Marriage would make the arrangement entirely proper under both law and custom. If Mrs. Henderson consents, there's no case here. All eyes turned to Lila. Her face was unreadable, emotions warring behind her eyes. We barely knew each other. This wasn't love. It was survival dressed up in vows. But maybe that was enough to start with. Yes, she said quietly, then louder. Yes, I'll marry you. Pettigrew's face went purple. This is a mockery. This is settled law, Judge Harrison declared. I can perform the ceremony right now if needed. Does anyone here have legal grounds to object? Silence. Even Pettigrew knew he was beaten on this front. Then I suggest, Harrison continued, that we disperse this gathering and let these good people get on with their lives. Unless Mr. Pettigrew has actual evidence of criminal wrongdoing. Not gossip, not family grudges, but evidence? Pettigrew's jaw worked, but no words came. He'd lost, and everyone knew it. As the crowd began to disperse, some angry, some relieved, most just confused, Lila pulled me aside. You didn't have to do that, she whispered. I know. We barely know each other. I know that too. This isn't how marriage should start. I met her eyes. Maybe not, but it's honest, and it's your choice. If you want to back out, we'll find another way. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, ask me again, properly this time. I took her hand. Lila Henderson, I can't promise you love, not yet, but I can promise you respect, partnership, and a home where you'll never be property or charity. Will you marry me? Her eyes were bright with tears. Yes, Elwood Garrett, I will. Behind us, Pettigrew was gathering his allies, his face twisted with rage. We'd won the battle, but the war wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Judge Harrison married us right there in the town hall, with Doc Miller and Sarah Goss as witnesses. It took all of 5 minutes. No flowers, no music, just plain words spoken before God and a room full of people who couldn't decide if they were witnessing salvation or scandal. When Harrison pronounced us man and wife, I didn't kiss Lila. Seemed presumptuous given the circumstances. Just shook her hand like we'd concluded a business arrangement, which I suppose we had. The crowd dispersed slowly, folks lingering in knots on the street, processing what had just happened. Pettigrew and his brother left without a word, Raymond Henderson skulking behind them like a whipped dog. But as we walked toward the wagon, I noticed something odd. Carl Drucker wasn't with them. Instead, he stood by the hitching post, watching us with an expression I couldn't quite read, not angry, almost relieved. Mr. Garrett, he called out. Mrs. Garrett, might I have a word? Every instinct told me to keep walking, but something in his voice made me stop. Make it quick, I said. Drucker glanced around, making sure no one was close enough to overhear. I need to tell you something about Pettigrew's plans. Why would you tell us anything? Lila asked sharply. You've been his attack dog this whole time. Because I'm tired of being on the wrong side. He rubbed his face, looking older than his years. I've worked for Pettigrew for 10 years. Done things I'm not proud of. Threatened people, bent the law, looked the other way when I should have stood up. But what he's planning now... He shook his head. I can't be part of it. What's he planning? I demanded. Your marriage stopped him legally, but he's not done. He's been buying up debt all over the county. Mortgages, promissory notes, IOUs. Anyone who spoke for you tonight, anyone who stood against him, he's going after them. Drucker's jaw tightened. Doc Miller owes money on his practice. Vernon Goss has a loan on his farm. Sarah Goss's brother works at the bank. Pettigrew's threatening to fire him unless Vernon backs down. He's going to systematically destroy everyone who helped you. My blood ran cold. That's legal, Drucker finished. Calling in debts, terminating employment, foreclosing on property, all perfectly within his rights as a banker and businessman. By the time he's done, you'll be isolated again, and everyone who stood with you will be broke or broken. Why are you telling us this? Lila asked, suspicion still heavy in her voice. Drucker was quiet for a moment. Because my daughter asked me a question this morning. She's 8 years old, and she asked if it was true that Mr. Garrett bought a lady to be his slave. Had to explain to my little girl about the auction, about what really happened. And you know what she said? His voice cracked slightly. She said, "Daddy, why didn't you help her?" He looked at us with eyes that had seen too much. Couldn't answer her. Because the truth is, I stood there laughing with the rest of them, stood there while a woman got sold like livestock, and I did nothing. Been doing nothing my whole life while Pettigrew runs roughshod over decent people. He straightened up. I'm done being that man. What do you want from us? I asked. Nothing. Just needed you to know what's coming. He started to turn away, then stopped. One more thing. Raymond Henderson, he's not really the one who brought the accusations. That was Sheriff Dugan. What? The word came out sharper than I intended. Dugan owed Pettigrew money, gambling debts from a few years back. Pettigrew found Raymond Henderson drunk in a saloon in Tulsa, paid him to come testify, but it was Dugan who set it all up. He's the one who suggested the investigation, who pushed Judge Walter to issue that order, who's been feeding information to Pettigrew all along. Drucker's expression was bitter. The man sworn to uphold the law has been the biggest criminal in the county. We just didn't want to see it. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Dugan, a man I'd known since childhood, who'd served as sheriff for 15 years, had been Pettigrew's creature all along. Can you prove it? Doc Miller's voice came from behind us. He'd been listening, along with Vernon Goss and a few others. Drucker nodded. I've got receipts, letters, records of payments Pettigrew made to Dugan. Been keeping them as insurance in case Pettigrew ever turned on me. Never thought I'd actually use them, but... He pulled a thick envelope from inside his coat. It's all here. Doc took the envelope, his hands shaking slightly. This could bring them both down. Could, Drucker agreed. But it'll take more than paper to beat men with that much power. You'll need people willing to stand up, willing to testify, willing to risk everything. He looked at each of us in turn. Question is, after everything that's happened, do you have the stomach for that fight? The small group that had gathered stood silent. These were people who'd already risked much by speaking up tonight. Now we were asking them to risk everything, their livelihoods, their homes, their futures. Vernon Goss spoke first. My daughters need to grow up in a county where the law means something, where men like Pettigrew can't just buy justice. He looked at his wife Sarah, who nodded firmly. We're in. So am I, Doc Miller said. Been practicing medicine too long to watch sick men like Pettigrew and Dugan poison this whole community. One by one, others spoke up. The baker's wife, old Tom Mitchell, the school teacher Miss Abernathy, who'd been silent at the meeting but whose eyes had been watching everything. Not everyone, maybe 15 people out of 100, but enough to be the start of something. Then we do this properly, I said. Doc, you take those documents to Judge Harrison first thing tomorrow. Vernon, you and I will talk to everyone who's been hurt by Pettigrew's debt collecting. We'll need statements, witnesses, evidence of intimidation. Miss Abernathy, can you write it all down, make it official? She nodded. I can do that. Drucker stepped back. His part played. One more thing. Pettigrew's planning something for your farm, Garrett. Don't know what yet, but I'd watch your back. Man who loses twice doesn't usually wait for a third chance to get revenge. As he walked away into the darkness, Lila squeezed my hand. My wife's hand now. Strange as that felt. This isn't over, she said quietly. No, I agreed. But now we're not fighting alone. Around us, the small group began making plans, voices low but determined. The revelation about Dugan had changed everything. The man they'd trusted to enforce the law had been the one breaking it all along. Tomorrow we'd begin gathering evidence. Tomorrow we'd start the real fight. But tonight, as I drove my new wife home under a sky full of stars, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate kind, but something stronger. The kind that comes from standing with people who've counted the cost and decided some things are worth fighting for. Elwood, Lila said as we neared the farm. Thank you. For today. For all of it. Thank you for saying yes, I replied. Even though it wasn't exactly a romantic proposal. She almost smiled. We can work on the romance later. Right now, I'm just grateful to be married to a good man instead of property of a bad one. As we pulled into the yard, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. There on the porch, someone had left a bundle of wildflowers tied with a ribbon. No note, but the message was clear. We had friends in this fight, even if they couldn't speak up publicly yet. Small gestures, small hopes. But sometimes that's all you need to start changing the world. The question was, would it be enough to stop what was coming? Judge Harrison called a formal hearing for Friday morning. Word spread fast. By dawn, the courthouse was packed tighter than the town meeting had been, but the atmosphere was different now, uncertain, divided. Pettigrew sat at one table with his lawyer brother Walter and Sheriff Dugan, whose face had gone gray since Drucker's revelations. At our table sat Doc Miller, myself, and Lila. Mrs. Garrett now, though neither of us had quite adjusted to that reality. Judge Harrison entered, and the room fell silent. This hearing concerns allegations of corruption, abuse of legal authority, and conspiracy to defraud, he began. Serious charges that strike at the heart of justice in this county. He looked at Dugan. Sheriff, you've been presented with documentary evidence suggesting you colluded with Mr. Pettigrew to manufacture legal proceedings against Mrs. Garrett. How do you respond? Dugan stood slowly. For a moment, I thought he'd deny everything, lawyer up, fight to the bitter end. Instead, he took off his badge and set it on the table. It's true, he said quietly. All of it. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even Pettigrew looked shocked. I owed Mr. Pettigrew money, Dugan continued, his voice hollow. Gambling debts I couldn't pay. He offered to forgive them if I'd help him with certain matters. Started small, looking the other way on some of his business dealings, then got bigger. The investigation into Mrs. Henderson, finding Raymond Henderson, pushing for that order from Judge Walter. He looked at Lila. I'm sorry, ma'am. I knew it was wrong. Did it anyway because I was scared of losing everything. Sheriff Dugan, Harrison said sternly, you understand you're confessing to corruption of office, conspiracy, and abuse of authority? Yes, sir. I do. Harrison turned to Pettigrew. Mr. Pettigrew, do you wish to respond to these allegations? Pettigrew stood, his face composed. Your Honor, Sheriff Dugan is clearly a troubled man trying to shift blame for his own failings. If he engaged in improper conduct, that's his responsibility, not mine. As for calling in legitimate debts that are legally owed to my bank, that's simply business. Business that happens to target everyone who spoke against you, Doc Miller interjected. Coincidence, Pettigrew said smoothly. I can't be held responsible for the fact that many people in this county are overextended financially. Harrison studied the papers before him. According to these documents, you've initiated foreclosure proceedings on 14 properties in the past 3 days. All 14 belong to individuals who testified or spoke on behalf of the Garretts. You're telling me that's coincidence? I'm telling you it's legal. And there it was. The truth we all knew. What Pettigrew was doing might be morally reprehensible, but it wasn't technically illegal. He could ruin lives within the bounds of the law, and there wasn't much anyone could do about it. Judge Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. Mr. Pettigrew, how much total debt are we talking about? Pettigrew consulted with his brother. Approximately $400 across all accounts. And if that debt were satisfied, you'd have no grounds to proceed with foreclosures? Legally, no, but these people can't possibly. I'll pay it, I said. Every head in the room turned toward me. Lila gripped my arm. Elwood, you can't. That's everything you have. Not quite everything, I replied, but close enough. It was true. The money I'd saved over 15 years of careful ranching, money I'd planned to use expanding the herd, maybe buying more land someday, would just about cover $3,400 if I liquidated everything. You'd bankrupt yourself for these people? Pettigrew asked, genuine confusion in his voice. Most of them barely know you. They stood up when it mattered, I said. That's worth more than money. Harrison leaned forward. Mr. Garrett, I appreciate the gesture, but I can't allow you to impoverish yourself. There must be another solution. There is, a voice called from the back. The crowd parted, and an elderly man walked forward, someone I'd never seen before, wearing a fine suit that marked him as wealthy and not from around here. I'm Franklin Satterfield, he announced. Mrs. Garrett's uncle from Tulsa. Lila stood slowly, her face shocked. Uncle Franklin? But I thought you weren't at the wedding, I assumed. I only just received your letter yesterday, he said gently. Came as fast as I could. He turned to Judge Harrison. I'm a reasonably successful businessman, Your Honor. Made my money in oil. When my niece wrote telling me about her situation, I was ashamed I hadn't reached out sooner after Earl's death. He pulled out a checkbook. I'd like to settle all debts owed to Mr. Pettigrew's bank by those who supported my niece. Consider it a family obligation. That's highly irregular, Walter Pettigrew protested. But legal, Harrison said with the ghost of a smile. Unless you want to refuse payment on legitimately owed debts, Mr. Pettigrew. Horace Pettigrew's face had gone purple. He'd been outmaneuvered, and everyone in the room knew it. This isn't over, he said quietly. Actually, Harrison replied, it is. Sheriff Dugan has resigned and will face charges. Judge Walter Pettigrew, your brother's involvement raises serious questions about your own conduct. I'll be recommending an investigation by the territorial authorities. As for you, Horace, you've broken no laws, but you've broken something more important, the trust of this community. I suspect you'll find that has consequences of its own. As the hearing adjourned, people filed out into the morning sunlight. Franklin Satterfield embraced Lila, apologizing over and over for not being there sooner. Doc Miller shook my hand. Vernon Goss clapped me on the shoulder. But the moment I remember most clearly came later, as Lila and I stood on the courthouse steps watching the sun climb higher in a cloudless sky. We won, she said wonderingly. I can't quite believe it. We survived, I corrected. That's different than winning. She looked at me, this woman who was my wife in name but still largely a stranger. Thank you. For everything. For the auction. For standing against the whole town. For being willing to lose everything. Lila, I interrupted gently. I didn't lose everything. I still have the farm, my health, and... I hesitated, then figured the truth was simpler than dancing around it. And a wife who's brave enough to face down the whole world when she knows she's right. That's not nothing. Her eyes filled with tears, the first I'd seen from her through this whole ordeal. I don't love you, she said bluntly. Not yet. Don't even know if I can after everything that's happened. I know. But I'd like to try, if you're willing to be patient. I took her hand, my wife's hand, and we stood there in the sunshine while the town of Millbrook went about its business around us. Changed, maybe. Or maybe just the same as it always was, with a few more people willing to do what was right instead of what was easy. I've got nothing but time, I said, and patience is free. She smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes. Then let's go home, Elwood Garrett. We've got a life to build. As we walked toward the wagon, I noticed something. Carl Drucker standing across the street, watching. When he caught my eye, he nodded once, then turned and walked away. A man trying to find his way back to being someone his daughter could be proud of. The sun was fully up now, burning off the last of the morning cool. A new day in more ways than one. We'd stood against power and won, not through violence or vengeance, but through the simple act of decent people refusing to look away when it mattered. It wasn't the ending I'd expected when I bid $200 for a woman at an auction 6 weeks ago, but it was the one we'd earned together. I'm an old man now, telling you this story from the porch of the same farm where it all happened. Lila's inside making supper, been married 43 years come September. Took us about 6 months before I love you felt natural instead of like words we were trying on for size. But we got there. The farm's still standing. Grew it some over the years, brought in good harvests when the rain cooperated, raised 3 children here, 2 boys and a girl. Taught them all the same thing my daddy taught me. Dignity ain't something you're born with or something someone can give you. It's something you choose every single day, especially when choosing it costs you everything. Horace Pettigrew left Millbrook about a year after that hearing. Moved to Tulsa. Started over where people didn't know his reputation. Heard he died in '52, alone in a boarding house with nobody at his funeral but the preacher. Carl Drucker stayed on, became sheriff after Dugan, and by all accounts did the job honest for 20 years. People can change, turns out, if they want to bad enough. Doc Miller lived to be 87. At his funeral, 30-some people stood up and talked about how he'd helped them when they had nothing to pay with. Vernon Goss's daughters all grew up strong. One became a lawyer, actually. Makes me smile thinking about that. See, what I learned that September in 1934 is this. The world's full of people waiting for someone else to do the right thing first. They're scared, which I understand. Got families to feed, bills to pay, reputations to protect. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right, even when your hands are shaking. If you've ever stood at a crossroads wondering whether to speak up or stay silent, whether to help someone everyone else has written off, whether to risk what you have for what's right, I hope this story gives you your answer. My wife's calling me in for supper now. We're having pot roast, same as we've had every Friday for 40 years. Some things are worth keeping. Until next time, may you have the courage to choose dignity over comfort, and may you never forget. Family ain't always blood, but it's always choice. Tell me where you're listening from. I'd like to know this story reached you.